for democracy, human rights, equality, and freedom of speech. At Air Dialogue, we understand dialogue to involve meaningful interaction and exchange between people of different groups who come together through various kinds of conversations or activities with a view to increase understanding. Today, we will focus on COVID-19 impact on education in Ireland. The spread of COVID-19 resulted in direct and indirect impact on education, widening the already existing educational divide. The aim of this panel is to demonstrate how COVID-19 is impacting students from different social groups, discuss possible measures to help in narrowing the learning divide between students and preventing long-term educational inequality in the context of COVID-19. We're honored to have three guests today joining us who will share their insight on this issue. There are mainly three sections of this panel. First, each panelist will share insights for about 10 minutes. After the speech, panelists could ask each other questions according to the speech content. Then it is Q&A section when we select questions from the audience. This panel will last about an hour in total. In addition, this panel is one of our dialogue events. If you hope to hear more from us, welcome to subscribe to our channel and be free to ask questions or make comments through the YouTube live chat. So first, let's welcome Eamon, who is the postdoctoral research fellow at EARI. Welcome, Eamon.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen now and hopefully it will work without any great issues. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Perfect, and you can see the slides showing up the presenter view. Perfect, thank you very much. So thank you very much for hosting me tonight and putting on this talk. It will be really interesting. And yeah, I've gone for a slightly melodramatic title now, Education in Crisis, just to catch a bit of attention. But I suppose, yeah, I don't think the Irish education system in general is in crisis, but I think the crisis is an interesting point to kind of look at the education system and see what it reveals about that system before, during, and then after the crisis. So specifically, I think crises are moments that really reveal what we value in terms of kind of what we do to save certain things, to prevent certain things from happening in a crisis, and also the things that are kind of inevitably lost in a crisis. We're kind of forced to take stock of that and think about what they do mean to us. And I think COVID has seen kind of both within education. Crisis as well, they kind of reveal the pre-existing fault lines in society in that, you know, there's no crisis that affects everyone equally. We're all affected according to the kind of resources we can mobilize to counter the situation and to kind of improve our lot. And certainly I think COVID is no exception on that front. And then finally, I think crises kind of show how much the world can be changed. And thinking back to March, April, May 2020, and both the kind of despair and the shock of it, but also I think there were real moments of kind of, you know, we can change everything and, you know, make the world a much better place in some ways. I remember the kind of carefree cities and people saying, well, it was like this all the time. The price of oil went negative, all these things. And I think in education as well, you know, there was a moment of like, oh, how much can be changed? And I suppose the one we'll come back to is the leaving cert, maybe at the end of this talk. But generally, there are certainly lots more. So the context for anyone who needs reminding is that in March 2020, in Ireland and 188 countries around the world, there were nationwide school closures. And in Ireland, certainly it was, I think, on the kind of 11th or 12th of March, everyone was told they weren't coming back in tomorrow. And that was that. So it was a rapid shift, I think he's even underestimating it, to distance learning in a home environment, which wasn't something that really anyone in Ireland had done in any meaningful sense before. So in May of 2020, myself and some other members of the education team and other teams in the ESRI did a study where we did an online survey of secondary school principals in Ireland and followed this up with some interviews. And the reason we chose to go through school leaders rather than our usual avenue, which would be to talk to students directly themselves, is to get something kind of quick, up and running, and something that would be kind of nationally representative. And what we found through the study was that overall, for school leaders at least, the move to online learning was kind of a success under the circumstances, but certainly not one they hope to repeat. And I think maybe more interesting than that was that schools really, the sense they gave us was that they were prioritizing maintaining contact and connections with students, maybe over academic content transmission. There was a general decline in engagement during online learning. Students were kind of engaging less, and this engagement was less effective, school leaders felt, than the normal classroom. But this decline was much more serious for some students than for others. And what I found, I think, particularly interesting was the way in which, for school leaders at least, the reduction of the school's ability to engage with students was central to the decline in students' engagement with school. So it was the fact that suddenly schools or the school kind of learning context was not as engaging as the classroom that they pinpointed as key to kind of students' reduced engagement. So in terms of what this shows us about what we value, I think the value we have for education itself really shone through in the incredible work put into keeping the show on the road through innovation, adaptation, and just sheer elbow grease by a significant proportion of schools and families. So obviously this might be one area where the school leader perspective doesn't fully tally with the student or parent perspective. And I know that different students, different families would have a different experiences in the kind of level of engagement with their school. But certainly for a lot of schools and a lot of teachers, there was a lot of kind of very quick adaptation performed, and people who'd never before taught a class online were kind of experts by the time schools broke up in June of 2020. And again, coming back to the idea of connection over content, this emphasis on teaching and learning in schools as relational spaces and as areas where the kind of pastoral relationship was as important as the kind of academic relationship, and the idea that maybe you can't even separate these two things, which I think was the right decision at the time. But looking forward, we'll have to think about what it means for the amount of knowledge and skills that students will have picked up during the last 2 years of severe disruption compared to where they might be at in a non-disrupted world. In terms of pre-existing fault lines then, I think the big concern is over widening inequalities. So there were maybe some inequalities that were newly created by the pandemic. I know that broadband suddenly became an issue where if you didn't have a home broadband connection, you were suddenly at a loss, whereas previously that wouldn't have had any impact. But I think more concerning were the pre-existing inequalities, which were significantly widened or exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think, unfortunately, but perhaps not unsurprisingly, it's the most vulnerable students who were the hardest hit. So students who were struggled more, students with special education needs, saw many of these needs unmet. And I think Joe is going to talk about this later on. And students already at risk of early school leaving were more likely to leave school. So in terms of the issues faced by students, some of them were directly pandemic related. So academically, school leaders reported that for teachers, at least, certain types of teaching and learning were just found to be less effective over online platforms. And the big one they mentioned, that struck me anyway, was feedback and the difficulty of giving high quality feedback to individual students through the online platforms. Socially, the loss of the classroom atmosphere had a huge impact. The loss of specific supports for some students, SNAs, homeschool coordinates, sorry, I should have realised to put in the acronyms. Not everyone spends all of their time in this world, so my apologies for that. So special needs assistants, homeschool community liaison officers, and child and adult mental health services. So again, from talking to school leaders, it's not that these support staff weren't doing their best during COVID, they just weren't able to provide support in the way they would in the classroom. And so these particularly impacted on vulnerable students, students with special educational needs, or students in DESH or designated disadvantaged schools. So there were digital issues in terms of access to broadband and suitable devices. But I think, at least in respect to devices, this was not as big an issue as maybe had been anticipated. And certainly in terms of what we valued, the speed at which devices were distributed to people was really impressive. The home learning environment became a huge issue. So for students living in cramped houses without space to study, or students where suddenly everyone in the family was trying to work at home on top of each other, this was obviously hugely disruptive. And then for a lot of students as well, things you wouldn't necessarily think of when you think of educational engagement, wider socioeconomic issues at home. School leaders that we talked to in the interviews reported trying to help students who were facing homelessness during this time and trying to kind of keep them involved in education while things were incredibly precarious and challenging for them. Families lost jobs, and there were kind of all sorts of issues, many of them obviously exacerbated by the pandemic. A lot of students had COVID in the house, which obviously had its own impacts. So I suppose the key thing here is that students weren't just facing one of these issues were kind of intersectional. And for many students, they were facing several of these at once. So for students would say with special educational needs, you know, the particular types of teaching and learning that are maybe most effective for them were suddenly ruled out. And for students maybe living in socially economically disadvantaged backgrounds, you know, they might be facing a smaller home learning environment, a smaller room, more crowded, less access to devices, all of these things. So things kind of piled on top of each other to have a very severe impact on some students and much less of an impact on other students. So returning now to the question at the start of how much can the world be changed, and, you know, what can we do to make those early pandemic dreams and fantasies a reality? I suppose the big three, from my perspective, would be, can we address key divides? So in terms of the digital divide, can we get rural houses access to high-speed broadband, which, you know, hopefully will be a fairly straightforward one to do, and hopefully will be spurred on by the pandemic. But I think if we can't do that, then that inequality could have serious repercussions down the line. In terms of socioeconomic divides and the SEN divide, you know, how much can we do? Because I think it's clear that the issues caused by the pandemic, or exacerbated by the pandemic, weren't caused by the pandemic, and that, you know, a serious influx of funding and new approaches are needed to tackle these issues that have only been made more clear over the last few years. And that's something hopefully we can tease out in the Q&A afterwards. And then the potential and pitfalls of digital learning. So I think during the pandemic, I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't had digital learning. You know, if this had been 20 years ago, would schools have been posting things out to students and getting them back in the mail? What would we have done? But I think, you know, it can be too easy as well to say, oh, well, you know, digital learning works, we can trust that with everything, when in fact there are very specific contexts, I think, where digital learning is a suitable replacement for classroom learning in some respects, where it might be better in terms of allowing students to engage in their own way and at their own pace. But I think it still can't provide that relational and that social side of learning, and it can't provide the level of feedback that a skilled teacher in a classroom environment can. And finally, I see I've gone over the 10 minutes despite promising I'd do my best not to. But in terms of Leaving Cert reform, I think the kind of stress of Leaving Cert students has been one of the main educational news stories we've all heard about in the last 2 years, or 3 Leaving Certs. And I think the questions around whether, as we kind of try and move back from the grade inflation and the general changes to Leaving Cert, whether we go back to the system we had in place beforehand, or whether we try and, you know, take some of what we've learned around predicted grades and, you know, other approaches than that kind of final high stakes assessment. Yeah, so again, I'll leave something for the Q&A as well. So thank you very much, and my email address is there.
Thank you, Eamon. So COVID-19 has kind of reshaped the way of teaching and learning. So school, the government, and families need to come together to work on it, to address this kind of new crisis, right? So thank you, Eamon. And then next, let's welcome Deirdre, Assistant Professor of Education at UCD. Welcome, Deirdre.
Thanks a million. Thanks, Sin. Thanks a million, Eamon. That was a brilliant presentation setting the context. And my first thing I have written here is how COVID-19 has forced us to hold a mirror up to our societies and to see what's reflected back. And I think we can see the deeply entrenched inequities within Irish society being reflected back during the pandemic, and equally within our education system. And I think, as Eamon referred to, some of that is directly connected with accessing resources such as time, space, place, supports, and actually skills as well to be able to access and engage with education at distance. I think one of the things as well we have to think about is, the familial responsibilities that landed on a lot of young people's shoulders during the pandemic, caring for siblings or caring for family members, which hindered their ability to engage in education. And again, as Eamon has said, and I know that Joe will talk about as well, accessing special educational support has been really challenging, and my question is really, have adequate resources been put in place to address the lack of supports available to children with additional learner needs? And I know Joe will talk about that. And for me, a key question is, what are the long-term impacts on young people disadvantaged during the pandemic? Because for me, again, early intervention is key. And I think instead of, just trundling on our journeys through education, I think we need to stop and take stock and think about what early interventions can we put in place now to prevent those gaps that Eamon referred to from continuing to widen. As Eamon referred to, the digital divide has been a particular conversation that we've had throughout the pandemic. And while technology has been brilliant and it has played a really critical role in facilitating the sharing of content for home activities from school and opened up the lines of communication between home and school, I think for the first time, it was a key source of educational capital during the physical school closures and throughout the pandemic. And problematic assumptions were made around digital kind of access to digital, the time, the space, and this digital skills required to be able to engage with content through digital platforms. And it was really challenging to ensure that all children and young people had access to those digital resources, as Eamon highlighted. Prior to the pandemic, the OECD actually identified that a lower percentage of Irish children had access to the computer at home for schoolwork than the OECD average, and particularly those in the lower quartile of socioeconomic distribution. And again, GUI data highlighting that half of 12-year-olds and only half of 12-year-olds had said that it was always true that they had a quiet place to study during and do their schoolwork during the physical school closures. But in saying that, I think, what has happened when it comes to digital resources is that it has proffered possibilities and opportunities to use digital technologies to address inequities within the system. But I think we have to be really careful that we take an equitable approach, which not only provides the resources, but also the skills required to engage through this medium. We have to be careful not to make any sort of assumptions around people's ability to use and engage with those resources. I think for me, we've also witnessed the important role and critical role and the invisible work, the invisible care work undertaken by schools to support students. I think there is an invisibility of the care work undertaken to support children by the education system until the pandemic. And I think that really highlighted that work that's done in schools. And the physical school closures highlighted the important work with schools engaging in outreach into their communities. And we see loads of examples of this through the homeschool community liaison scheme, through school completion programs, and teachers and SNAs providing resources and supports to families and putting things in the post to them as well. I think what it does is, for me, it calls into question the high reliance on schools as sites for care, and whether there's a need for an increased integration of approaches between schools and care agencies. It also highlights the vital role of the relational in schools, as Eamon has referred to. And for example, this can be small things like just checking in with students. How are you doing? How are you getting on today? And the importance of that. giving the supports and motivation to the students, the high fives, the well done, that you're doing great there. And the relational in terms of teaching, how we teach and how students learn through pedagogy is embedded within the relational aspects of schooling. The building of relationships is so important within education. And when you take that away, it's very difficult to do anything, I think, in education in a really meaningful way. And of course, the relational in schools really helps students understand themselves and understand others, and almost create their identity as Irish citizens and global citizens. So such relational engagements are especially important when working with children who are more vulnerable within our system, and time is key. It takes time and emotional investment to build the relational. The pandemic, in fact, for me, highlights the duality and interdependency between educating and educaring within our education system. So what do we need to do going forward? I think my first call is really to ensure agency within wider school communities to be able to respond creatively to the needs of students. Schools and teachers are inherently creative in their work, and the pandemic actually provided a virtual window into the power of the school and teacher agency when they had the freedom to innovate, create, and transform the education system beyond anything we could even imagine before the pandemic in a really intensive period of time. I mean, they really turned the ship very quickly. And we witnessed the power and transformative possibilities of agency across the system through the pandemic. And I think it's really important we harness this creativity and innovation and apply it to how we teach and support those most marginalized within our education system going forward. The second thing I'd like us to consider when we're moving forward is children and young people's voices, because they were very much silenced during the pandemic. Children's worlds were and still continue to be destabilized during the pandemic, and particularly when they were restricted from engaging in the informal spaces of childhood, including things like playing with their friends. And that impacted directly on how they live and see their lives, and hence on their well-being. For me, one of the saddest images was when we could finally bring our children to the playground. And I remember distinctly bringing my own three to a playground and seeing the grass under the swing, and any parent or anyone who's brought a child to a playground will know that there's never any grass under a swing because it's the most used place in a playground. And let's hope that never happens again, because what we did really was restrict children from engaging freely in their childhood. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child emphasizes the importance of listening to children and young people about issues that directly impact on their lives. And yet they were given very little space, place, or time to share their views, particularly relating to the pandemic. And I was listening to a really powerful interview with Don O'Leary from the Cork Life Centre at the weekend. And he said that we tend to hear the noise, but we don't listen to children. And children are their own masters. They are very good at explaining what is going on for them if you are willing to listen. And I think we need to create a space within education, within the Department of Education, where we are listening, and we're listening with intent and with a desire to make change. Because we cannot underestimate the impact of not listening to children on how they view themselves as active and valued citizens in our society. I think schools can continue to lead the way to ensure that children and young people have the opportunity to learn about and through child rights to empower their agency as active citizens in our society and as global citizens too. I think the third point I'd like to make about the future is around investment. We need increased investment in education. Ireland is investing well below the OECD average in primary to tertiary education as measured against GDP. Irish classrooms are among the largest in the OECD. I think we now need to stop and take stock within education. We need an identification of the needs post-pandemic and audit within schools to identify what resources are required. And then we need to provide adequate and appropriate resources to support schools, support their students. I think we need an especially targeted response over the coming years, particularly in DEIS schools, to address children and young people's needs, and not just academic needs, their social needs, their emotional needs, and their physical needs too. The fourth point I'd like to make relates to well-being. I think children, students, and school community well-being has been really impacted during the pandemic, and we need to put that now at the heart of provision moving forward. We need to think about taking a trauma-informed response to what we do in our schools. Andy Hargreaves argues that the quality and morale of teachers is absolutely central to the well-being of students and their learning. And I think the pace and intensity of changes over the past 2 years impacting on child and school community well-being has been profound. And we need to stop, take stock and plan for how to respond to this in a really meaningful way. We can't just plaster over the cracks any longer. I think, the system is creaking. I think we need to really stop it and think about what we're going to do. And a slow down, pause and reflect approach is really needed. Finally, you'll be glad to hear, my third point relates to how we rebuild a contemporary education system moving forward. Education for me is the foundational pillar upon which Irish society is built. It shapes our identity as active and empowered citizens of the world. The pandemic has demonstrated how agile, dynamic and responsive our education system can be, and we need to harness this moving forward, particularly in ensuring we meet the needs of those most vulnerable within our system. If, as Paulo Freire argues, education is the practice of freedom, we need to ensure that schools, children and young people are entrusted with the transformational agency required to build a dynamic, responsive and inclusive system post-COVID-19. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. Somehow the COVID has given us a chance to reflect on the education system and how we can change it to make a difference. And also for children, like interaction, engagement is very important in their childhood. That's great. And so next, let's welcome Dr. Joe. Joe is a associate professor for the first head of School of Inclusive and Special Education in DCU. Welcome, Joe.
Yeah, good evening all, and thank you for your kind invitation. Thank you to Eamon and Deirdre for really insightful commentary and insights on many of the difficulties and the opportunities that have been thrown up from the pandemic. So what I hope to reflect on this evening, hope to look at three things. Firstly, I suppose the impact of the pandemic on children with special education needs and disabilities. And secondly, I want to just delve a little deeper in that through looking at it through the lens of the UN's indicator of rights for equality, inclusive education, which are four A's. So they're availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. And thirdly, then I'd like to look to the future and how we could, I suppose, move forward and address some of the what Eamon called there the SEN divide, some of the difficulties that we know those children have encountered, and what we don't know is the long-term impact of the crisis on them. So, firstly, I suppose to reflect on that on the impact. So, when I'm talking about, say, children with special education needs or additional needs or children with disabilities, it's important to recognise that they're not an homogenous group, and I think it's useful to think in terms of Norwich uses this framework of common needs, where all children have the same needs in a lot of areas, the need to be loved, the need to be cared for, and so forth. Then some children have shared needs with a particular group. So it may be that they are deaf or hard of hearing, for example, and they would share particular needs with that group that others wouldn't. And then all children have individual or unique needs. So in responding, I suppose, to children's needs, it's useful to think in terms of those common, shared, and individual needs. And then you're taking people's different contexts into account. So we had different levels of support, you had different home situations, you had homelessness, you had poverty, and so on. What we do know from the evidence is that it was, highly disruptive to children and young people with special education needs and disabilities. And in many cases, it was those with the most complex needs who suffered more. And when you think about that, you can see, I suppose, some of the reasons for that. So the elements that are so important for them, relationships, that relational component that has been mentioned earlier by Eamon and Deirdre, routines, structures, friendships with peers, access to supports. Each of these was severed. So that a break in relationships, a break in routines, a break in structures, a break in meeting their peers, a break in the support services that many of those therapeutic support services that many of those children required in order just to access education. Now, the difficulty was that none of these were easily replicated online. And, it led to, frustration, anxiety, uncertainty. And unfortunately, many of those children experienced, regression in their learning, in their well-being as a result of that. And it created much greater variability in, their new learning environment. So, as Deirdre mentioned earlier, in schools, we have access to space and time and resources and support and skills. But in the out of school environment, access to each of these, that space, time, resources, support and skills, particularly digital and broadband, was just extremely uneven and inequitable, and in some cases inappropriate in terms of how you would meet those kids' needs. So the impact on those for whom the online environment was not amenable or accessible to learning was greater. So that was a kind of key element of it. Now, at the same time, schools did respond magnificently, and they that quick pivot to online, that move to caring and compassion, and looking after their school community as best they could. There's lots of stories of hope and examples of courageous leadership out there from principals and teachers and SNAs to reach out to children with special education needs and disabilities, and they have to be acknowledged and commended for that work. Then at home, you had some of the children, say, with more complex needs might be immunocompromised or underlying health conditions as well. So there was added anxiety at home, from parents and caregivers and so forth, in terms of their loved ones actually becoming infected. So that was an added burden that maybe those who were healthy had less a fear of, and that added to as I said, anxiety. Then when children came back to school and were very, very excited to come back to school, but they did come back with increased worry and anxiety, and teachers reported, difficulties around that level of anxiety and worry about rules and regulations and pods and masks and so forth. And it played out sometimes in terms of difficulties with self-regulation and exhibiting what they call now in the literature behaviors of concern. And for children who rely, for example, on, say, total communication, seeing an adult with a mask on it's very difficult for them to relate to. In some of the children, say with autism, were in special classes, and schools would have had lots of systems where they would have interacted with, you might call their neurotypical peers, and those interactions, were curtailed as children were I suppose had to remain in their pods and so forth. So if you think of as I said, the 4 A's that the UNESCO and the UN refer to when they're talking about indicators in terms of meeting rights to education and having an equitable, inclusive, quality system. So first one, availability. So straight off, there was issues around just availability and lack of access at the most basic level. Then in terms of accessibility, so the digital tools and so forth worked for some children with special education needs. And as I said at the start, you have to be careful, that you don't treat this group as an homogenous group. So for many, they were absolutely fantastic in terms of the access they got to digital tools that really supported their learning, and that catalyst to I suppose learn more about technology, as Deirdre and Eamon have mentioned earlier. That's a huge benefit that we have coming out of this, and schools really up their game in that space. But teachers will report, and parents have reported, the value, for example, of teacher recordings. Simple as a teacher reading a passage, a teacher modeling maybe a mathematical procedure, and those little video snips, instead of it being a once-off in the class, were now recorded, could be revisited, could be paused, could be rewound, and so it gave I suppose access to how words are pronounced. It allowed the teacher to model say fluency in reading. It showed the step-by-steps in conceptually understanding a particular concept. So I think that aspect was really beneficial for a lot of children who could benefit from that accessibility. Then acceptability is really around, I suppose, evaluating the appropriateness of what we provide, and the ideal is what we might call individually relevant learning. So, is what I'm engaging in individually meaningful and relevant for me? And that was very, very difficult to deliver for children with special education needs and disabilities. To do that, it requires a level of assessment, engagement, use of assessment for learning, ongoing monitoring and feedback that teachers would do in a small group situation, a one-to-one context. That was very difficult to do. And the fourth one then is adaptability, which is around the sort of modifications, changes to the curriculum, to teaching approaches, to pedagogy, to assessment, and so forth. And again, those changes, those adaptations, while we're amenable for some children online, where some of the digital tools could be adapted and modified, and allow greater access, engagement, participation, benefit. For others, that just wasn't the case, particularly for those with more complex needs. So the third part of my input tonight is I suppose to reflect on the future and where we might go here. So I suppose my main focus is on inclusive education, and I suppose I would love if we had a vision, of a more inclusive system. And inclusion basically asks, it can be very, very complex, and at the same time, it can ask very simple, hard-hitting questions, such as who's in and who's out of our education system, whose needs are being met, whose needs are not being met, why are we failing some learners, and what are the barriers experienced by some of our students. So I think we need, a broader vision of an inclusive system, an inclusive school, inclusive communities and neighborhoods. And it starts in the local school, where all have access to that school, where all are able to engage, participate, and benefit. Deirdre mentioned earlier the importance of prevention and early intervention, and that is absolutely crucial. The strongest evidence base in educational research, the strongest coming from longitudinal studies, is around the long-term benefits of prevention and early intervention. Now, we've had, unfortunately, a cohort of children who've now come into the education system who have been, as it were, denied that kind of early intervention and preschool, quality preschool experience. So I think if we're talking about something immediate to be done, I think it's to target those children, early intervention, junior, senior infants, lower class sizes, co-teaching, have a second teacher in the room in those classes. I think that would make a big difference initially, because we know from the research, the earlier you intervene, the better. For example, if you take, say, early number knowledge, we know that children just starting school, say age 4, it can be a 3-year difference in early number knowledge. In other words, some children are operating like developmentally as 3-year-olds, some as 6-year-olds. If you don't intervene there, and a lot of the intervention is just due to lack of experience in early counting, in hearing the language of number and so forth. But if you don't intervene, that gap just widens. And by the end of primary school, that gap is 6 to 8 years. So then you can imagine the impact of that as children transition into post-primary school. So that early intervention is absolutely key. So at a systems level, then, there are factors within schools, there are factors between schools, and there are factors beyond the school that we need to look at when we're looking at this issue. And one of the areas where we're very poor on is the intersection of health supports and education supports in the system. And we have responsibilities divided across education, health, children, HSE, voluntary bodies, and so forth. There's a total lack of coherence there at a governance level, at a policy level. So a lot more can be done there. And there's some interesting research being done by the NCSE in an in-school therapeutic demonstration project, which I think shows a lot of promise in terms of occupational therapists, speech and language therapists working alongside teachers. And I think that's a model that shows a lot of promise for the future in terms of the sort of supports that will be needed if we truly want an inclusive system. We also need, I think, to move towards more personalizing education. As I mentioned earlier about individually relevant learning. And that requires having a much deeper knowledge of each learner, their strengths, their interests, concerns, challenges, needs, priority areas for development. And that has implications for the type of assessments that we carry out. These need to be holistic. And as Deirdre mentioned earlier, to include student and parent voices as partners in the learning process. So we get a really holistic profile understanding of each learner. And then we look to prioritize, personalize, tailor, so that what they're engaging in is meaningful and relevant. And that will lead to increased levels of engagement in the system. So at a policy level, we need greater coherence around inclusive education, a focus on early intervention, lower class sizes with more co-teaching, and a greater personalized approach to the curriculum. So there would be the areas, and health and education working closely together. They would be the areas I suppose I would highlight as giving great, I suppose, leverage for progress in the system. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Joe, very insightful. And so to make change it early for children. And also actions need to be made according to the special needs of a group of people. Yeah. And so next section. So do you have questions for each other?
I suppose one of the areas I'm interested in is, in terms of teachers, say, pedagogy and approach to teaching and learning. They've had, experience now with technology, digital tools, and so forth. Do you think there will be a more, blended approach in schools in the future? Has enough of a shift been made? Is there enough support to maintain that, or do you think it could revert back to the way it was? I suppose that's something that I'm curious about.
Yeah, well, I start maybe, Deirdre, and you can. I know I stole a lot of what you were going to say in the initial ones, so I don't want to do that again. But I think, I think if nothing else, it struck me there earlier on today when they announced that schools and colleges in 7 or 8 counties were going to be closed tomorrow because of the storm. And, you just kind of felt bad for the students, because when I was in school, that would mean we'd all have a nice day off. Whereas now it means you're in the laptop instead of at the classroom. So I think certainly there are a few things like that that are, set that way for good now, that, when there's a snow day or there's a day where the school building can't be accessed, there will be online classes instead. Whether this will translate more widely into kind of really meaningful blended education, I think will vary school to school level and maybe even teacher to teacher level. I think some teachers remain kind of more comfortable with it and more adept at it. But I think what was really interesting during the pandemic, from what we saw in our research, is that teachers, A, kind of adapt and innovate themselves, but B, are very good at talking to other teachers and finding out what's working for them and what's not working for them. So I think that, over the next few years, good approaches could kind of ripple through the education system, and we could see a kind of Darwinian evolution. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about in the main presentation, but didn't have time, but kind of reflects on this, is that several of the school leaders that we interviewed, they mentioned that they would have a number of students who would have been kind of school refusers nearly before the pandemic, where they weren't really attending school at all. And there was one school leader who had somebody, I think, who hadn't been in a classroom in maybe 3 years, but when they transitioned to the online education, suddenly those students were comfortable in the learning environment, and the one who hadn't been in school in 3 years was attending perfectly and engaging fully. So I think that as well as like at the school level, at the individual level, maybe there's a lot of scope for looking at what a better approach might be to personalize it, as you were saying, Joe, and to meet young people's needs and what suits them best.
I think that's a great question and a great answer, Eamon. A great question, Joe. I think it's a sad day when we can't have a snow day, because because I really think that, you know, it calls into question what we value as learning, you know, and you know, seeing education as learning in and of itself. You know, I think we overlooked that a little bit at the beginning of the pandemic, with the urge to put children in front of workbooks, you know, or in front of live Zoom lessons, rather than actually having them look outward into their garden or out their windows, or, you know, observing as much and learning from what was going on around them, as opposed to just focusing towards a workbook. You know, I think there's a bit of that I was concerned about. But I think in order to harness what you're saying, Joe, I think we need to stop and capture where we're at and what we've learned from what's happened over the past 2 years. And I feel the time is passing so quickly. We're on to the next thing and the next thing, where, you know, we haven't actually stopped. Schools have been in crisis mode and are still in crisis mode. I mean, school communities within them are fragmented. There's no staff room. There's little opportunity to share that deep learning that teachers have been engaging with, except for maybe via Zoom call. So, you know, I think there's a lot of having to recollect together as a school community, and to have those conversations in order to harness that learning and move forward. But my concern is that teachers, school communities that have been traumatized as much as anybody else, and won't be given that opportunity. And that would be as sad as losing a snow day in Ireland, you know.
Yeah, no, they're very good insights, yeah, from both of you. Yeah, no, it'll certainly be a challenge, but I think, you know, there's, you know, a skill base has been built up there that would be, you know, really important, that's supported and built on, that it would be really beneficial. I loved the references you had there to the outdoor learning and you know, linking in with seeing the learning environment broader than the classroom and so forth. And, you know, I think again there were rich opportunities there. And I think, you know, as we're lucky in that, say, particularly at primary level, teachers and schools still have, you know, a fair amount of autonomy around how they organize their time and the curriculum and the sort of approaches. You know, they're far less scripted, for example, than might be happening in the UK. So it'd be wonderful, you know, if they continue to tap into that wider creativity in learning. In the way resources can be used as well, there was a new special education needs allocation model introduced to schools in 2017, which gives them a lot more autonomy around how they portion out resources, with those with the greatest need meant to get the largest amount of resources. Now, some research that we did initially, we found that there was a lack of confidence, maybe to take that opportunity, and some were a little bit fearful of moving from the earlier system, where there was, you know, particular hours assigned to particular children based on disability categories. And but I think there's movement from that now. That's another opportunity that's there, where there's autonomy that schools can use to tailor the supports better. And I think you know, prioritizing in-class support, particularly at the junior end of the school, is well justified. And where you have that second teacher, in some cases, you could have, say, 3 adults in the room. You have a special needs assistant, two teachers. Now, I know it's used, say, for station teaching and so forth, but I think it could be used for a lot more creative approaches to pedagogy and and the curriculum and I suppose use of the classroom outside as well, where you have those extra adults. So and it allows for that sharing that we thought about, that Eamon was mentioning there in relation to the technology as well, because that sort of teacher collaboration is probably one of the biggest changes in my lifetime is in education, is the single teacher, single class. Then you had S&As in the class, then you had in-class support, and it's moving to a much more collaborative model of joint responsibility and decision making and sharing. And that's wonderful to see in the system.
Yeah, very great question and insights. So let's go to pick up some questions from the audience. So this question is for Eamon. So do you consider the steps taken by the Irish government during school closure adequate? What could have been done differently?
Oof, getting into a controversial territory here, but I think, I won't come from a public health perspective because I'm not an epidemiologist, but purely from an educational perspective, I think there certainly are things that could have been done differently. I think overall the approach was good and the support was strong, but I think there are kind of key things like even the closing of school, the announcement on the day the schools were to close, the kind of teachers and school leaders and students were given no advance warning, that they couldn't even kind of go in to collect things that might have been useful then. I think that was maybe a poor decision, but obviously one made in the very heat of the moment. I think that there were some criticisms early on around the maybe the inspectors in the department kind of continuing in an auditing role rather than recognizing the situation and moving into a more straightforwardly supportive role. But I think that once these kind of criticisms were made, they were kind of addressed in a very meaningful way. And I think once you got into September of 2020, into that school year, I think the supportive role was much stronger. I think another area where we really need to take a deep, long look, and it comes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about kind of making the most of digital technology, is that schools really were kind of inundated with suggestions and offers and probably, phishing scams of educational technologies that they should be using. And I think that the support they were offered there often was just, forwarding on collections of things without any really kind of curation. And so it was up to kind of individual teachers and school leaders to decide what they were going to use. So again, in the heat of the moment, I think that's kind of making the best of the situation. But in the long run, if we are going to move to a more blended model of education, and if these things are going to be an important part of our classrooms, I think we really need to make sure that we're kind of using the right ones and in the right ways, and not just taking whatever comes our way first. And I think that a kind of more central approach there, and again, I don't think it should be a prescriptive one where schools are told what to use, but I think even just like a central database outlining the strengths and weaknesses of these would be extremely helpful.
Thank you, Eamon. Thank you so much. And there's another question for Deirdre. So can we, as a community, do something to alleviate education inequalities?
Well, there's another big question. That is a huge question. I think as a society, actually, I think we need to start there. I think we need to start by having a national conversation around what we value in education, and what we espouse within our society. We can only really dream to meet and address inequalities within our society if, as a community, we come together to aim and strive for that. And it has to be meaningful and come from a national conversation around what we want for education. I think one of the things that emerged for me, certainly during the pandemic, was this gap in understanding between what society thinks happens in schools and the reality of what actually does happen in a classroom or in a school. And I think we need to close that gap, because, you know, we could see the narrative around education very quickly change from this celebratory teachers are great kind of narrative at the beginning, where everybody was at home trying to deal with and support their children's learning, to then very quickly a very sort of divisive narrative that started to emerge. And you have to remember, you know, that narrative is very damaging to our education system. It undermines it. And certainly as a community, we should come together and, you know, strengthen our education system. And we can only do that by having a really clear understanding about what it is we value within education, what it is we want from education for our children, for our society, for our communities, and for those most marginalised across all of our communities in the country. So that would be my answer to that one.
Thank you so much. And here's a question for Joe. So regarding education inequalities, do you think it is more pronounced in urban or rural areas?
So educational inequalities more pronounced in urban or rural areas. I think that's a difficult one. What we do know, say from the research, particularly from the Education and Research Centre, and their studies on reading and in mathematics, that there are a cohort of what are called DESH Band 1 schools. So there would be schools with the most severe levels of disadvantage, and those schools are more prominent in urban areas. Now, that's not to say that there isn't rural disadvantage. There is, but it's more dispersed, and it's not as concentrated, because you have smaller schools. But it is more concentrated in some schools in urban areas, where I suppose there's like a critical mass of layers of disadvantage built up over generations in communities, and that the effect of that can be more severe and can be more difficult to intervene with. So in terms of responses, we haven't got to a situation yet, I suppose, where we have a sophisticated enough tracking system which is able to identify levels of disadvantage in order to tailor the resources where they're most needed. So we have I suppose, you know, two or three levels, and schools will fall into those levels in terms of a response. We're unusual in that outside of the education training boards, we don't have regional or local structures in education. And in some countries, you would have support services that are suspended from a regional or local service. And they would have an overview of that particular area and be able to respond where there is particular issues or concentrations of disadvantage in rural or urban areas, regardless. There was a proposal in the 90s to set up a regional system for Irish education, and that didn't happen at the time. So as I said, outside of the education training boards, that is a gap. And what you notice is that some of the support services try to recreate their own. So NEPS has a particular regional service. NCSE has a particular regional service. The HSE has a different regional service. So there's a lack of coherence then across the various regional bodies in terms of working together and addressing. So I suppose I've gone a little bit beyond the question there in terms of how we might respond to those levels of disadvantage, but the research would suggest that there are higher concentrations of disadvantage in some urban areas that's intergenerational.
Thank you so much, Joe. So yeah, time flies. So to end this panel, would you like to make a brief conclusion, like 1 or 2 sentences for each of you?
I'll start and just say, in relation to, say, children with special educational needs and their access to education and so forth, that it's not a charitable endeavor, that these children have rights and a human right to access to an inclusive education, which means a quality education where they're engaging, participating, benefiting from that experience. And I think that rights-based approach is something that we need to develop in the future. Thank you.
And Deirdre?
Thanks, Joe. I was just taking a few notes as everybody was speaking, and I suppose 3 key themes jumped out at me. The first relates to divides. There's been a lot of division and fracturing within the education system over the past 2 years. And I think we need to have a good examination of that and really get those early interventions in place to address those divides, those divisions. The second is around rights, and that came out very strongly, I think, across the 3 presentations. I think we need to now hold ourselves accountable as a society, as an education system, around all of the children and young people within the system and whether we're meeting their right to an education. And then the third is around the relational. And again, a very strong theme that emerged, and the power of the relational for really transformative change across our system. And I'm going to borrow a phrase that Joe used, courageous leadership. And I think what we need now is we need to see some courageous leadership to lead our education system now going forward, to make sure that we have a more equitable system, a more creative, a more responsive, a more dynamic education system as we move forward post-pandemic.
Great, thank you. And Eamon?
I'd like to certainly echo what Joe and Deirdre have said. And I suppose a quote that I've been thinking about a lot the last 2 years, so from back in 1970, Basil Bernstein, an English academic and sociologist, said that education cannot compensate for society. And I think that really we do ask, like in Ireland and across a lot of the Western world especially, we do ask education to compensate for society, where we send children into school with these very unequal and uneven life experiences and backgrounds, and then we expect kind of 14 years or 18 years of schooling to, present an equal opportunity to all students. And I don't think the education system necessarily can do that, but I think there's a lot more it can do. And, if we look at things like the DESH program, it's been extremely successful in evening up these opportunities a bit. But I think that kind of more recent findings suggest that maybe the closing of the gap that we saw at the start with the DESH program might have maybe stalled a bit. And I think the question is maybe, have we reached the limit in terms of closing that gap that we can get with the current setup and the current level of investment? And if we have, then I think we're left with the question of, do we accept that, or are we going to stand up and put more resources to it, more effort into it, and fight harder? And, I think the DESH is a good example, but, it's the same for students with special educational needs. A big issue would be students from kind of disadvantaged backgrounds, not in DESH schools, who aren't getting even that support. And just widely, You know, I think it was Deirdre mentioned the underfund, or the high level of students, the high number of students in Irish classrooms before the pandemic. You know, that really came back to bite us, I think, in the way that underfunding maybe of our health system did in terms of ICU places. And so, you know, we can't just lurch back into how we were pre-crisis and wait for the next one. I think we've got to be very proactive and, yeah, really tackle these issues seriously.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eamon. Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, every audience, for joining us today. If you hope to hear more from us, welcome to subscribe to our channel, and wish you all a very good evening. See you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Million. Thank you.
Very much.